Friends and family of Nikki Whitehead say they believe she was killed by her daughters.
Right now we gotta be strong so they can catch the person who did it.
Nikki Whitehead was found beaten and stabbed. Police found blood throughout her home.
What did y'all do?
They put in the tub. It wasn't like it was a fight on the street. It was more of a fight till somebody died. I really wish it didn't happen like that.
Identical twins, Jasmiyah and Tasmiyah Whitehead, seemed to be making their way towards a good life. With good grades, plenty of friends, and after-school activities, these two young women were just getting started in life. But after a troublesome relationship with their mother Nikki for years, on January 13, 2010, the sisters came home to find their mother dead in the bath. She had been stabbed 80 times. They tried to convince the police that their mother's complicated romantic life was the cause of her death, but the more investigators asked, the more contradictions they found in their story. Contradictions that were backed up by physical evidence, confirming this crime of passion had come from someone even closer to Nikki, her own daughters. Despite fighting for their innocence at first, both women confessed before their trial and were sentenced to 30 years in prison each. But there's a lot to go over to really understand what was going on inside Jas and Tas's minds. Welcome to the back of the archive. Join me as we go over the disturbing case of Jas and Tas Whitehead, the twins who killed their own mother in cold blood. To understand her daughters, we first have to take a look at their mother. Nikki Whitehead was born in 1975 in Atlanta, Georgia. However, Nikki wasn't born in what one consider regular circumstances. Her mother was in prison. Run-ins with the law caused by substance abuse had led Nikki's mother to be incarcerated for some time while pregnant, thus giving birth behind bars. Because of this, Nikki was sent to live with her grandmother Della. Della raised Nikki as best as she could, but from a very young age she said Nikki was not an easy kid. She frequently got into trouble, and as she got older, she began hanging out with the wrong crowds and dabbling in drugs. And then, at the age of 17, she found out she was pregnant. Pregnancy for a young mother is hard enough, but when Nikki found out she was having twins, things got more complicated. However, with the help of Della, she got through it, and in November of 1993, she welcomed two identical twin girls into the world, Jasmiyah and Tasmiyah Whitehead. What started as a dabble with drugs quickly became an addiction, and young mother Nikki became involved in anything except taking care of her children. Jas and Tas, as they were known by almost everyone, were raised by Della, their great-grandmother, and the woman who had also raised Nikki before them. However, Della had it much easier this time. The twins were great at school. They studied, they got good grades, they were involved in sports and dancing. They were even part of the Girl Scouts. Jas and Tas were always together, and not only were they physically identical, they also liked the same things, hung out with the same crowds, and would spend all their time with each other. All in all, they seemed happy and didn't give Della a hard time. Everybody spoke great things about them. Nikki was almost always away and would only come home occasionally. She was still an addict and unfit to take care of her twins, so Jas and Tas distanced themselves from her more and more. Nikki didn't like this, so she decided to get her life back on track. She wanted to change for the better. In the year 2000, 25-year-old Nikki met Robert, a 55-year-old truck driver who she began dating. Her relationship with Robert, despite the age difference, seemed to help her find balance again. She decided to get clean. She completed her studies, she got her diploma, she found a job. She hated that her daughters treated her more and more like a stranger, and she was fighting to make amends. In 2007, Nikki won custody back, and Jas and Tas moved in with her and Robert, who was away most of the time working as a driver. The twins didn't like this change. Nikki set a lot of limits and ground rules. No phones at the table, no coming and going as they pleased, no talking to older boys. Jas and Tas were good students, but their great-grandmother wasn't running a strict home, so both twins had a lot of freedom to do as they pleased. When they moved in with Nikki, they were confronted with a discipline they didn't care for. This resulted in the beginning of a large number of confrontations between Nikki and the twins. Jas and Tas would disobey their mother's rules to the point where Nikki once even called 911 because Jas had snuck out in the middle of the night to be with her boyfriend. When Nikki found her 13-year-old's bed empty, she panicked and called the police, only to find Jas was fine hours later. As years went by, the twins became more and more defiant, to the point where Nikki began to fear them. The three would get into arguments which escalated and became physical quite rapidly. The police had to intervene more than once, and visits to the courthouse became regular. Nikki would accuse the twins of hitting her, but they would just accuse her back. In many of these altercations, it would only be Nikki who had scratch marks and bruises on her. The twins briefly returned to their grandmother's at one point, but in early January of 2010, they were sent back to live with their mother. Despite the counseling required by a judge, despite the several police visits and the endless accusations going back and forth, nobody expected what would happen days later, on January 13th of 2010. On the afternoon of January 13th, 2010, police were called into Nikki Whitehead's home. It was her daughters who made the call. They found something terrible when they got home from class that day. Their mother was dead in the bath, and it looked like somebody had murdered her. Nikki was in a blood-filled bath, and the examination of her body determined she had up to 80 stab wounds. This level of brutality could only mean this was a crime of passion, probably someone who knew Nikki very well. Both twins were in a panic state, crying and afraid. The young women were brought into the station, and at first, police began talking to who they thought were just victims in this tragedy. However, as soon as they started asking questions, contradictions started popping up. As soon as they began talking, Jas and Tas tried to direct the conversation towards a romantic dispute between their mother and her partner Robert. The twins claimed Nikki had another boyfriend, and Robert had caught her on the phone with him. This discovery, they thought, could have triggered an attack. They also mentioned their father could be involved, since he was out of the picture and he and Nikki didn't get along. But both men's alibis were solid. They were nowhere near the area when Nikki was brutally murdered. Why were the twins so interested in leading police down their romantic crime road? Investigators found it odd and began asking questions to Jas and Tas concerning their whereabouts and the steps they took that day.
What time did y'all leave the house?
We missed the bus, so we had to walk.
You walked all the way to Rockdale?
It's not far.
Made all your classes today?
Yes.
Is that the clothes you wore to school today?
Yes.
The more questions police would ask, the more agitated they got, and police described their reaction towards their mother's death as empty. They were crying, but there were no tears. The lack of empathy was obvious. It was all a show. During all the footage from the station, both Jas and Tas were aware that they were being watched, and made sure to appear distraught and nervous.
Mommy. Mama.
When questioned together, they tried to help each other out, resulting in confusing and contradictory statements. This is why police decided to separate them.
Alright, Taz, I want you to come out here and sit with them for a minute. I want to talk to your sister.
Why y'all gonna separate us?
Because we need to talk to y'all separate. I know it sounds mean, but it's really not.
And once alone, the holes in their story began to appear more obvious. Tas and Jas claimed they went to class that morning, arriving just a few minutes after the bell rang. They didn't come home until the afternoon, and that's when they found their mother. However, surveillance footage from school disproved this statement. They weren't seen entering the building until mid-morning. They also claimed to have walked to class, but cameras in the area caught the twins getting into an unknown car that dropped them off at school. But the evidence the police had at that moment wasn't enough. There was still a lot to go through in the crime scene, but for the time being, Jas and Tas were sent back to their great-grandmothers until more details were discovered. The crime scene gave investigators a lot of clues about how it all went down. Some of the sinks and floors had been wiped clean, but as well as blood on the floors and the bathtub, they found blood on some of the twins' clothes, which had been stuffed into a closet. There was also a pair of boots with blood on them, hidden in a box in the closet. Inside the boot, investigators found a clump of hair with blood on it, wrapped in tissue paper. Nikki's body also gave away plenty of details. She was full of bruises and scratches, and in between her teeth, they found hair. When it was analyzed, they found it belonged to one of the twins, but it was impossible to know which one exactly, since identical twins have the same DNA profile. This meant Nikki had put up a fight, and her attacker was bound to have injuries too. This is when one of the officers recalled something bizarre that happened when he was taking Jas and Tas to the station. While they were in the car, they saw Tas biting into her own arm. When they asked her what she was doing, she said it was a nervous habit she had when she was anxious. With that in mind, police took a closer look at her arm, and saw that the bite mark she had was not just hers. She'd been trying to cover another mark underneath, a mark that, when analysed closely, was a match to Nikki's bite mark. The hair found in between her teeth had been bitten off Tas's arm. For 4 months after the murder, police built up a case with all the evidence recovered, and when they had enough, Jasmiyah and Tasmiyah Whitehead, who were leading a normal life after the events of January, were arrested and charged with the assault and murder of their mother Nikki. From the moment they were arrested, both Tas and Jas fought to prove their innocence. They knew there was no murder weapon, and they knew much of the evidence was circumstantial, but the bite mark and the DNA in Nikki's teeth placed them in the struggle. Investigators also found a journal at their home, which the twins used to communicate. There were several entries talking about removing their mother from the picture before it was, quote, too late. With all this evidence, and while they were awaiting trial, Jasmiyah and Tasmiyah finally admitted in 2014 that they did indeed kill their mother 4 years earlier. They pleaded guilty to the charges of voluntary manslaughter, falsification in government matters, and possession of a knife during the commission of a crime in the death of their mother. According to their testimony, this is what happened on January 13th, 2010. After being sent to live back with their mother, Jas and Tas were not adapting well, and fights with her would occur daily. The morning in question, they slept through their alarm, and when they entered the kitchen, their mother started to argue about them being late. The fight escalated, like many others had before, and they claimed that Nikki hit Jas with a plant pot. Jas took that same plant pot and hit her in the head. Surprised by this blow on the head, Nikki allegedly reached for a kitchen knife, and the physical fight between the three of them started. As the twins tried to take the knife from Nikki, their mother was accidentally cut, leaving more blood on the kitchen and living room floor. At one point in the fight, Nikki ran out of the house and attempted to get help from the neighbor, leaving a bloody footprint that would later be found by crime scene investigators. When the neighbor didn't answer, the twins say their mother went back into the house and sat down. That's when they say their mother threw herself at the kitchen knife to try and grab it, so they grabbed it first and deliberately stabbed her. After multiple stabs, Jas and Tas dragged their mother into the bath. At this point, Nikki was still alive and even talked to her daughters. But after a few minutes, she was no longer speaking. She was gone. After that, the twins spent a few hours cleaning and disposing of evidence, as well as getting their story straight to know exactly what they would tell the police. Then they went to class to try and get an alibi as to where they were that morning. However, they didn't know the cameras would show the real time they got there, and not what they told the police. Many believe this confession and the remorse they put into their statements in 2014 didn't come from a place of redemption, but as part of a plea deal that would reduce their sentence considerably and would avoid going through a trial that could get them life in prison. Thanks to this plea deal, they settled for a 30-year sentence in prison, which they're both serving to this day. Thank you for watching. I hope you found this video interesting, and if you did, please give it a like and leave a comment telling me your thoughts about this case. Also, subscribe if you haven't already. I post a lot of true crime content, and I'm sure you'll find many more cases to watch in the back of the archive. As always, thank you for being here, and I'll see you very soon with a new video.